They said it was the weather. They said nothing could have survived the storm. But 50 years later, when the ice finally gave up its secret, what investigators found inside wasn't just wreckage. It was a message. In 1975, a routine cargo flight disappeared over the Alaskan wilderness, leaving behind nothing but static and silence. 5 crew members, a plane full of supplies, all gone without explanation. The official report cited severe weather conditions and pilot error. Case closed. Grief managed. Memories filed away. Until now, when glaciologist Dr. Lena Carver's research team stumbled upon metal fragments protruding from the Juneau ice field in 2025, they expected to find remnants of old mining equipment. What emerged instead was the ghostly outline of a C-119 flying boxcar, perfectly preserved after half a century beneath the ice. But the real shock wasn't that they found the wreckage, it was what they found inside. A final message, scratched in blood on the cabin wall. Classified equipment never meant to be discovered, and evidence that the crew's disappearance wasn't an accident at all. This isn't just another story of humans against nature, of pilots losing battles with Alaskan storms. This is about voices silenced by something far colder than ice, institutional secrecy that buried 5 men and the truth alongside them. What really happened to Arctic Cargo 66? Why did officials rush to declare it lost when no proper search was conducted? And most importantly, why did someone go to such lengths to ensure this plane would never be found? The answers lie in these warning signs. The subtle irregularities that, when pieced together, reveal not just tragedy, but conspiracy. Listen carefully, because what happened in Alaska's frozen skies could be happening right now, in places you'd never think to look. On March 11, 1975, at precisely 9:42 a.m., the final words from Arctic Cargo 66 cut through the static on an otherwise routine Tuesday morning at Elmendorf Air Force Base Control Tower. Air Traffic Controller Eric Halden was logging his 7th consecutive hour of an unexpectedly extended shift when Captain James Moore's voice interrupted the monotony. Juneau Center, we have visual on... A pause. Static interference. Then, that's not supposed to be here. The transmission ended abruptly. No distress signal, no mayday call, just silence, and the ghostly hum of dead air. Halden immediately attempted recontact, following standard protocols for communication loss. His calls went unanswered. Radar showed the C-119 flying boxcar continuing on its programmed route toward Fairbanks for approximately 90 seconds after the final transmission. Then the blip vanished entirely from the screen. What makes this final communication so disturbing isn't what was said, but what wasn't. Captain Moore, a 15-year veteran with over 7,000 flight hours, didn't report mechanical failure. He didn't mention severe weather. He saw something that shouldn't have been there, something unexpected enough to distract him from standard radio protocols. This pattern appears with unsettling frequency in aviation mysteries. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 pilots reported unusual lights before crashing in the Everglades in 1972. The crew of Stardust Airlines radioed the cryptic message Stendek before disappearing in the Andes in 1947. These weren't panicked maydays, but confused observations, the verbal equivalent of a double take before disaster struck. When voices falter and signals die this way, they often indicate the first signs of interference. Not mechanical, but deliberate. Someone or something disrupting normal operations. Think of it as the communication equivalent of a canary in a coal mine. When the singing stops unexpectedly, something dangerous has entered the environment. The official Air Force investigation dismissed Moore's final words as probable disorientation due to weather conditions. But weather conditions that day were recorded as clear with moderate winds. Nothing that would disorient a pilot of Moore's experience. and Halden would later reveal something the report conveniently omitted. The audio tapes from that morning were collected by military security personnel less than 30 minutes after the disappearance. When portions were returned to the control tower 3 days later, the final exchange had been notably shortened. Someone didn't want those last words examined too closely. And that's the first warning sign most people miss. When fragments of communication disappear, they often mark the exact moment when truth was sacrificed for a convenient narrative. 5 days after Arctic Cargo 66 disappeared, flight engineer William Dane's wife, Margaret, received an unusual phone call. A man identifying himself as Major Thomas Kelvin from Defense Logistics requested she search their home for any paperwork her husband might have brought home in the days before the flight. When she asked why, the caller's response was terse. Standard procedure for missing aircraft investigations. But nothing about this call was standard procedure. Margaret later told her son that William had indeed brought home papers the night before his final flight, something he'd never done in 15 years of service. He'd seemed troubled while reviewing them at their kitchen table. But when she asked what was wrong, he'd simply shaken his head and said, "Probably nothing. Just some last-minute changes that don't make sense." The next morning, those papers were gone, along with William Dane. When investigators began compiling evidence for the official report, a curious anomaly emerged. The cargo manifest, the document detailing exactly what Arctic Cargo 66 was transporting, was missing from both the departure and destination files. In its place was a cover sheet marked "Restricted," with a security classification stamp and the code phrase Project Goliath. Civilian supply. Flights rarely carried classified cargo. When they did, specific protocols required separate documentation and security personnel. Yet no such personnel were recorded on the flight's departure log, and the base's security checkpoint had no record of inspecting classified materials that morning. Even more disturbing. When Margaret Dane requested copies of her husband's service records as part of her survivor benefits application, pages covering the 2 weeks before the disappearance had been removed. In their place was a simple notation: records transferred to secure archive under Special Directive 775C. This pattern of vanishing paperwork appears throughout history when operations cross the line from merely classified to deliberately concealed. During the Cold War, dozens of civilian contractor flights transported radioactive materials, chemical weapons precursors, and experimental technology across American airspace. These flights operated under what the intelligence community called gray documentation, paperwork that existed only long enough to move materials before being destroyed or classified beyond reach. A 2017 declassified Pentagon review acknowledged that between 1952 and 1979, at least 17 domestic transport flights carrying sensitive materials disappeared with all hands. None of these incidents were publicly investigated as potential security breaches. All were attributed to weather or pilot error. When paper trails vanish this way, it isn't administrative oversight. It's institutional self-protection. Documents don't randomly disappear. They're deliberately removed because they connect dots that someone doesn't want connected. The absence itself becomes evidence, a vacuum that marks where truth once existed. And in the case of Arctic Cargo 66, that vacuum concealed something more dangerous than mere bureaucratic secrecy. It hid the real reason 5 men vanished without trace. The night before Arctic Cargo 66 departed Elmendorf, the 5-man crew gathered at the Moose Lodge, a small bar frequented by military personnel just outside the base. The bartender, Calvin Norris, now 82 and living in Tacoma, remembers that evening with unusual clarity because of what he overheard. They weren't celebrating like crews usually did before a routine run, Norris recalled in a 2022 interview. They were huddled in the corner booth talking real quiet. I heard the navigator, Harris, I think his name was, say something about unauthorized flight path adjustments. The captain, Moore, kept saying, "We follow orders, but we document everything." This wasn't simply pre-flight nerves. It was recognition of specific irregularities that the crew found troubling enough to discuss privately, away from base. Co-pilot Robert Jenkins called his wife at 11:30 p.m. that night, an unexpected call that woke her. According to phone records obtained years later through a Freedom of Information request, the call lasted just under 4 minutes. Jenkins' wife would later tell investigators that he seemed distracted and asked her to make sure his personal logbook was in his desk drawer at home, not in his flight bag. When she asked why, he simply said, "Just making sure everything's where it belongs." The most revealing premonition came from flight engineer William Dane. His personal diary, discovered decades later by his son, Elliot, hidden in a sealed box in their attic, contained entries from the 3 days leading up to the flight. The final entry, dated March 10, 1975, read, "Third manifest change in 24 hours. New equipment loaded under escort. No documentation provided. M says ignore it, but I've logged serial numbers separately. Something's not right about tomorrow's flight. Weather reports clear, but they've assigned us the storm route. If anything happens, it's all in my secondary logbook." That secondary logbook was never found. Human intuition often recognizes danger before conscious awareness can name it. It's our oldest survival mechanism, the instinctive recognition that something in our environment has changed in ways that threaten our safety. When experienced professionals express concern, it's rarely unfounded paranoia. It's pattern recognition based on thousands of hours of experience, noticing when standard procedures are being violated. This phenomenon appears in numerous disasters throughout history. 24 hours before the Challenger disaster, engineers expressed concerns about O-ring performance in cold weather. 3 separate crew members on the Edmund Fitzgerald reported feeling uneasy about the vessel's loading and weather forecasts before its fatal final voyage. These weren't supernatural premonitions. They were trained professionals noticing subtle warning signs that others ignored. In the case of Arctic Cargo 66, the crew's collective unease represents more than just nerves. It shows 5 experienced men independently recognizing irregularities serious enough to discuss privately, call home unexpectedly, and document separately from official channels. They sensed the approaching shadow before they could name it, and that shadow would eventually swallow them whole. On June 17, 2025, Dr. Lena Carver's team was conducting routine core sampling on the Juneau ice field when their ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly 47 meters beneath the surface. The glacier had been receding at an unprecedented rate due to climate change, revealing geological features and debris that had been encased in ice for decades. What they found that day wasn't geological. "At first, we thought it was just an unusual mineral deposit," Dr. Carver explained, "but the radar signature showed distinctive right angles, not something that occurs naturally in glacier formations." As the team adjusted their equipment for a more detailed scan, the shape became unmistakable. The outline of a large aircraft, almost perfectly preserved within the ice. The team marked the coordinates and notified authorities, expecting standard recovery procedures for what they assumed was a recently crashed small plane. They were wrong on both counts. When specialized recovery teams began carefully melting access tunnels to reach the wreckage, they discovered not a recent crash, but a perfectly preserved time capsule. The aircraft identification numbers matched Arctic Cargo 66, the plane that had disappeared without trace 50 years earlier. The preservation was extraordinary, unlike crashes exposed to the elements, where evidence degrades rapidly. The glacier had created a hermetically sealed environment. Bodies remained intact, instruments still in place, even paper documents legible after half a century. But it was what the ice had preserved that defied all explanation. The aircraft showed no sign of crash damage. The fuselage was largely intact, with minimal compression from ice pressure. The control surfaces showed no evidence of emergency maneuvering. Most significantly, the crew were found still strapped in their seats. without the positioning typically associated with crash preparation. Captain Moore and co-pilot Jenkins were found at their stations, hands still positioned on controls, as if the plane had simply stopped flying while in normal operation. Flight engineer Dane's body told a different story. He was found halfway between his station and the cargo hold, his logbook clutched in his left hand. And on the bulkhead next to his station, scratched into the aluminum with what forensics would later determine was a mixture of blood and hydraulic fluid, were 5 words: "Don't trust the cargo." This message, preserved perfectly in the freezing temperatures, represented something extraordinarily rare in aviation disasters: a conscious, deliberate warning created during or after whatever event had doomed the aircraft. Inside the cargo hold, investigators discovered something else the official manifest had never mentioned. Behind the standard supply pallets was a reinforced container approximately 2 meters long, secured with specialized locking mechanisms. The container bore no military or civilian identification marks, except a serial number, GL775C, matching the special directive code that had been used to classify William Dane's service records. Ice preservation has previously revealed crucial evidence in numerous cold cases. The frozen remains of climbers on Mount Everest have provided evidence about their final moments decades after disappearance. In 2005, an Andean glacier released the wreckage of a 1972 flight, revealing evidence of cannibalism among survivors that had been hidden for 33 years. In each case, the ice preserved what would have otherwise been lost to decomposition and erosion. What makes the Arctic Cargo 66 discovery unique is not just what was preserved, but what that preservation reveals about the nature of the incident. This wasn't a plane that crashed due to weather or mechanical failure. The evidence suggests it was a plane that was deliberately brought down, potentially by something it was carrying, something important enough that records of its existence were systematically erased for half a century. The glacier didn't just preserve the wreckage, it preserved the truth, a truth that would have remained buried forever, if not for the accelerating melt patterns of climate change. As if the Earth itself had finally decided to reveal what humans had tried to hide. 2 weeks after the discovery of Arctic Cargo 66, retired air traffic controller Eric Halden received an unexpected visitor at his modest home outside Palmer, Alaska. At 78, Halden had built a quiet life far from his former career, rarely discussing the decades he'd spent guiding aircraft through Alaska's challenging airspace. The visitor was Elliot Dane, son of flight engineer William Dane, and now a documentary filmmaker specializing in government accountability projects. Elliot had tracked down Halden through military records, hoping the controller might remember something, anything, about his father's final flight. What he discovered was much more than memory. It was evidence. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," Halden told him, leading the way to a storage shed behind his house. From beneath floorboards covered by fishing gear, Halden retrieved a small fireproof box. Inside was a reel-to-reel magnetic tape labeled simply AC66 Complete. "They took the original recordings that day," Halden explained, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over the tape. "Military security, not standard NTSB investigators. When they returned the official tape 3 days later, nearly 2 minutes were missing from the final exchange. I knew something wasn't right." Halden had secretly created his own backup recording of all transmissions that morning, standard procedure for his personal flight logs, but a direct violation of security protocols for classified communications. He'd kept the tape hidden for 50 years, too afraid to come forward, but unwilling to destroy what might be the only evidence of what really happened. When audio forensics experts at MIT analyzed the complete recording in 2025, what they found changed the entire narrative of Arctic Cargo 66's disappearance. The official recording had ended with Captain Moore's cryptic statement, "That's not supposed to be here." Halden's complete version continued, "Moore, that's Not supposed to be here. Control tower. Arctic Cargo 66, please clarify last transmission. More. Unidentified aircraft at our 3 o'clock, matching our altitude and speed. No transponder signal. Background voice, presumably Flight Engineer Dane. Captain, we've got an equipment malfunction in the hold. Temperature spike in container GL775. More. Control, we need immediate. At this point, a high-pitched electronic interference overwhelms the transmission for approximately 4 seconds. When audio returns, it's fragmented. Unknown voice. Shut it down now. More. Unintelligible. Not responding to Dane. Radiation levels exceeding. Then silence. Complete radio dropout. 17 seconds later, a final transmission comes through, significantly weaker and distorted. Unidentified crew member. They knew. God help us. They knew what would. The recording ends there. No further transmissions were received from Arctic Cargo 66. Audio analysis confirmed several critical points. First, the recording had not been damaged or degraded. The interference occurred during the original transmission. Second, voice print analysis identified at least one statement came from someone not listed as crew, a sixth person on the aircraft. Third, specialized equipment detected a secondary transmission signal overlapping the aircraft's frequency during the interference period. Evidence of potential jamming or electronic countermeasures. This pattern of altered or erased recordings appears throughout history when incidents involve sensitive operations. Following the USS Liberty incident in 1967, key communications were accidentally overwritten. During the 1976 Tehran UFO incident, Iranian air defense recordings were confiscated and never returned. In each case, the missing audio coincided precisely with the most critical moments of the event. When official records are sanitized this way, the very absence becomes evidence. Like shadows that reveal the shape of something deliberately hidden from light, these gaps in the record point directly to what someone decided was too dangerous to preserve. Eric Halden kept that tape hidden for 50 years, living with the knowledge that the truth had been deliberately erased. I always wondered if I could have done something different that day, he told Elliot Dane. Maybe if I'd asked more questions when they took the tapes. Maybe if I'd reported the unidentified aircraft that our radar briefly picked up near their position. Maybe those men would still be alive. The tape Halden preserved didn't just restore missing audio. It restored accountability. The possibility that after half a century, someone might finally answer for what happened to Arctic Cargo 66 and the men aboard it. As word of the discovery spread, Dr. Carver's research team faced unexpected resistance from government agencies. Within 48 hours of reporting the wreckage, the site was declared a restricted zone by the Department of Defense, citing potential hazardous materials and national security protocols dating back to the Cold War era. Dr. Carver was ordered to turn over all photographic evidence, scanning data, and personnel records related to the discovery. Her university received formal notifications warning of funding repercussions if full cooperation wasn't immediate and complete. But before the military containment team arrived, Carver had made a decision that would prove crucial. She contacted Elliot Dane directly. I found the name scratched into the ice core sampling equipment, she explained during their first meeting at a cafe in Juneau. William Dane. I looked him up and found articles about the missing flight. Then I found your documentary work. I had a feeling the official channels might not tell you what we found. What Carver shared with Elliot was more than just information about his father's final resting place. It was comprehensive documentation of everything her team had recorded before the military takeover. High-resolution photographs of the wreckage interior, 3D scans of the cargo hold, spectroscopic analysis of unusual radiation signatures emanating from the reinforced container, and most importantly, clear images of the message William Dane had left behind. Don't trust the cargo. 50 years after disappearing into Alaska's vast wilderness, William Dane was finally speaking, and his son was listening. Armed with Carver's evidence and Halden's unedited recording, Elliot began constructing a documentary investigation that would piece together the true story of Arctic Cargo 66. His approach wasn't merely personal, it was methodical. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests targeting previously unreleased military archives. He tracked down family members of other crew members. He consulted with aviation experts, Cold War historians, and former military personnel familiar with classified transport protocols. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate concealment spanning 5 decades. The most damning evidence came from declassified Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA files that mentioned Project Goliath, the same code name stamped on the cargo manifest cover sheet. Though heavily redacted, the documents referenced field testing of electromagnetic pulse generation systems in isolated environments during the exact time period of the flight's disappearance. Further connections emerged when Elliot located Catherine Harris, widow of navigator Thomas Harris. She provided her husband's personal letters, which mentioned growing concerns about unauthorized testing of equipment during transport runs in the weeks before the fatal flight. Tom kept saying they were using cargo planes as guinea pigs, Catherine recalled, testing how new systems would affect aircraft in flight without proper safety protocols. He filed 3 official complaints about it. After the third one, his commanding officer told him to drop it or find another career. The Glacier had preserved more than just physical evidence. It had preserved a narrative that powerful interests had spent 50 years suppressing. A story of institutional recklessness, callous disregard for crew safety, and the systematic erasure of accountability. When glaciers melt, they don't just reveal what was lost, they expose what was hidden. The ancient Vikings understood this when they said, "The frost giants hold secrets even the gods fear." In modern terms, environmental change has repeatedly uncovered evidence of historical events deliberately obscured from public knowledge. From nuclear testing debris appearing in melting Arctic ice to toxic waste dumps exposed by retreating mountain glaciers. The Arctic Cargo 66 discovery represents this principle at its most profound, nature itself becoming an unwitting archivist of human deception, preserving evidence until changing conditions finally bring truth to the surface. As Lena Carver told Elliot during one of their evidence review sessions, the glacier doesn't care about national security or classified operations. Ice just preserves whatever it encloses until it's ready to give it back. In that way, it's actually the perfect witness, completely impartial, impossible to intimidate, and eventually, given enough time, it always testifies. As Elliot Dane's investigation deepened, patterns emerged that connected Arctic Cargo 66 to a broader history of classified operations, where crew safety was sacrificed for experimental objectives. Through FOIA requests and interviews with retired military personnel, he uncovered at least 7 other incidents between 1965 and 1982 where transport aircraft disappeared under similarly suspicious circumstances. In each case, the official investigation cited weather or pilot error. In each case, evidence suggested classified cargo was aboard. And in each case, families reported unusual security protocols following the disappearances. Personal effects withheld, papers confiscated, unusual restrictions on what could be said publicly about the missing crew. The most disturbing connection came from retired Air Force Major Harold Werner, who had served on the Accident Review Board for 3 separate incidents, including Arctic Cargo 66. In a recorded interview conducted just weeks before his death in 2023, Werner finally broke his silence. "We were ordered to reach predetermined conclusions regardless of evidence," he explained, his voice weakened by advancing cancer, but his memory still precise. For the 66 incident specifically, we had radar data showing another aircraft shadowing them before they disappeared. We had background radiation readings from their last known coordinates, that made no sense for a cargo plane. We even had a partial transmission indicating equipment failure in a container that wasn't supposed to exist. Werner paused before continuing. When I raised these discrepancies, my superior handed me transfer papers to a weather station in Greenland. The message was clear. Sign off on the official report or end my career in Arctic exile. I had a family to support. I signed. This pattern of institutional coercion and enforced silence extends far beyond military operations. From the tobacco industry's suppression of cancer research to chemical companies hiding environmental contamination data, organizations consistently choose self-preservation over public safety when accountability threatens their interests. What makes the Arctic Cargo 66 case particularly egregious is the multiple layers of concealment. First, the apparent use of unknowing crews to test dangerous equipment. Second, the falsification of accident investigations to hide these activities. Third, the 5-decade campaign to ensure all evidence remained buried, literally and figuratively. The psychological impact on families was equally calculating. Mary Jenkins, daughter of co-pilot Robert Jenkins, described how military officials approach survivor families. They told us it was instantaneous, that our fathers never knew what happened. They said it was kinder not to pursue details, to accept that some questions wouldn't have answers. They offered slightly higher death benefits if we agreed not to speak with the press. They made seeking the truth feel both futile and somehow unpatriotic. This strategic management of survivor expectations is a documented tactic in high-profile disasters with institutional liability. By framing curiosity as harmful to healing and questions as disrespectful to the fallen, organizations effectively weaponize grief against those most entitled to answers. Perhaps most telling was the discovery of internal Department of Defense correspondence from 1977, 2 years after the disappearance, referencing the need to maintain information containment regarding Project Goliath test subjects. Not victims, not fallen servicemen, test subjects. This dehumanizing language reveals how institutional secrecy corrupts ethical frameworks from within. When people become data points in classified operations, their lives and deaths are assigned value based on expediency rather than humanity. As environmental attorney Rebecca Martinez noted in her analysis of the case, the true cost of institutional secrecy isn't measured in dollars or even lives lost. It's measured in the erosion of trust between citizens and the organizations meant to serve them. When agencies decide their mission justifies deception, they're not just lying about one incident. They're poisoning the relationship between government and governed. The legacy of Arctic Cargo 66 isn't just about what happened to 5 men on a March morning in 1975. It's about the system that decided their lives were acceptable collateral damage, then spent 50 years ensuring no one would be held accountable for that calculation. On October 3, 2025, exactly 50 years and 7 months after Arctic Cargo 66 disappeared, Elliot Dane received an unexpected email. The sender, General Marcus Westmore, current head of Air Force Special Projects, the modern iteration of the department that had overseen Project Goliath in 1975. The message was brief. Regarding your ongoing investigation and impending documentary release, your father deserves better than the story you're preparing to tell. Meet me at the Arlington Officers Club tomorrow, 2 p.m. Elliot's first instinct was to ignore what appeared to be an intimidation tactic. His documentary, The Frozen Truth, The Silenced Crew of Arctic Cargo 66, was scheduled for streaming release in just 11 days. The editing was complete, the evidence assembled, the narrative locked. But something about the message's tone, particularly the reference to his father deserving better, gave him pause. After consulting with his legal team and arranging for Lena Carver to maintain secure backups of all materials, Elliot agreed to the meeting, What transpired was not what he expected. General Westmore, 68 and nearing retirement, arrived alone. No aides, no security, no lawyers. He brought a single secure tablet and a small black case that looked like it might contain a weapon. The two men sat at a corner table, observed only by Elliot's attorney, waiting discreetly at the bar. "I've seen an advance copy of your documentary," Westmore began without preamble. "Most of your conclusions are correct, but not all of them. Before you release it, there are things you should know. Things even our classified archives don't contain." The general activated his tablet, entered 3 separate security codes, and displayed a document with classification markings Elliot had never seen before. "This is called a multi-generational security directive," Westmore explained. "It's a protocol for information so sensitive that its classification extends beyond normal declassification timelines. There are fewer than 30 MGSDs still active in the entire defense establishment. Project Goliath is one of them." The document confirmed what Elliot had largely pieced together. Arctic Cargo 66 had indeed been carrying an experimental electromagnetic pulse generation system, a weapon designed to disable enemy electronics without the radioactive fallout of nuclear options. What Elliot hadn't known was the weapon's true purpose. "It wasn't designed for foreign deployment," Westmore continued, scrolling through schematics. "It was developed as a domestic containment system, a way to selectively disable infrastructure in American cities in case of civil unrest or insurrection. The tests were conducted over Alaska because it combined low population density with strategic military importance. If something went wrong, the damage would be limited and explainable." According to Westmore, the device aboard Arctic Cargo 66 was the 3rd prototype, following 2 successful but limited tests. This version had 10 times the projected range, with the potential to disable electronics across an area the size of Chicago. The containment system that was supposed to prevent premature activation failed during flight, likely due to altitude pressure changes that engineers hadn't properly accounted for. "Your father wasn't just the flight engineer," Westmore said, his voice softening slightly. "He was also the only crew member briefed on what they were carrying. Standard protocol. One person on the transport team needed to know basic operational parameters in case of emergency. The others were told it was sensitive weather monitoring equipment." Elliot felt a surge of anger. So my father was complicit in this? He knew they were transporting a weapon designed to be used against American citizens? "No," Westmore replied firmly. "He was told it was a defensive countermeasure for protecting Alaskan early warning systems from Soviet electronic warfare. The domestic application was compartmentalized at the highest levels." But once the device began activating in flight, he recognized something was very wrong with what he'd been told. The general opened the black case, revealing not a weapon, but an old, battered logbook. The secondary logbook William Dane had mentioned in his final diary entry, the one that had never been found. "Your father managed to encode a transmission before the device fully activated. It didn't go to air traffic control. It went to a secure channel monitored by Project Goliath supervisors. He reported the malfunction and requested emergency protocols. Their response was to activate the device's self-destruct mechanism." Elliot stared at the logbook, then back at Westmore. "They deliberately killed the crew to protect the project?" Westmore nodded slowly. The official who gave that order believed the technology was more valuable than the lives of 5 men. He rationalized it as preventing a potentially catastrophic EMP event over populated areas if the device continued to malfunction during the remainder of the flight path. "But that's murder," Elliot said, his voice barely controlled. "Premeditated murder by the United States government." "Yes," Westmore agreed simply. "It was. And it's still technically classified as a matter of national security, even 50 years later." The general pushed the logbook across the table. Your father hid this in a compartment the recovery team didn't check thoroughly. It contains his notes on the irregularities he observed in the days leading up to the flight, including his growing suspicions about what they were really transporting. The last entry was written in flight after he realized the device was activating. He knew they were going to die. Elliot opened the logbook with trembling hands, seeing his father's familiar handwriting. The final entry was brief but devastating. Device activating without authorization, containment failing, radiation levels climbing. Control isn't responding to emergency protocols. I believe this is deliberate. If found, tell Margaret I love her. Tell my son the truth. We weren't killed by weather or mechanical failure. We were silenced because we saw what we weren't supposed to see. Why are you showing me this now? Elliot asked, struggling to process both the confirmation of his worst suspicions and the sudden appearance of his father's final words. Because your documentary is missing the most important part of the story, Westmore replied. You've exposed what happened, but not why it matters today. He tapped his tablet again, bringing up a document dated just 3 months earlier. Project Goliath never ended. It evolved. The technology has been refined, miniaturized, and expanded. The current iteration is called Project Heimdall. It's being prepared for domestic deployment under the guise of critical infrastructure protection. Elliot stared at the general in disbelief. You're saying they're still developing weapons to use against American citizens? And you're part of this? I'm part of the oversight group that's been trying to shut it down from within, Westmore countered. There's a faction within the defense establishment that believes domestic population control will be necessary in the coming decade due to climate instability, resource shortages, and political polarization. They're preparing technological solutions that would make martial law enforceable with minimal military personnel. The general's expression hardened. I took an oath to protect this country from enemies foreign and domestic. Sometimes the domestic threats wear uniforms and sit in Pentagon offices. I can't stop this program through official channels. But your documentary might create enough public pressure to force congressional oversight. Why should I trust you? Elliot demanded. For all I know, this is elaborate disinformation to discredit my work. Westmore gestured to the logbook. Your father's words, his handwriting, his warning from 50 years ago that's still relevant today. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to complete the work he tried to do before they killed him. As their meeting concluded, the general left Elliot with a final thought. The men who made the decision to sacrifice Arctic Cargo 66 are long dead, but the system that enabled that decision is very much alive. Your father didn't die because of a weapon malfunction. He died because an institution valued its secrets more than its people. That hasn't changed. 3 days later, Elliot made significant revisions to his documentary, incorporating both the historical evidence of institutional betrayal and its modern implications. The message scratched in blood on the aircraft bulkhead, "Don't trust the cargo," took on new meaning. A warning not just about what the plane was carrying, but about the corrupt system that had placed it there. The warning echoed across 50 years of institutional secrecy, as relevant in 2025 as it had been in 1975. On October 14, 2025, The Frozen Truth, The Silenced Crew of Arctic Cargo 66, was released simultaneously across multiple streaming platforms. Within hours, the documentary had been viewed over 2 million times. Within days, that number climbed to 15 million. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans groups demanded a congressional investigation into historical cases of service members endangered by classified weapons testing. Civil liberties organizations filed emergency FOIA requests regarding Project Heimdall. Media outlets that had initially dismissed the story as conspiracy theorizing scrambled to verify Elliott's evidence, finding it meticulously documented and increasingly corroborated by new whistleblowers coming forward. 3 days after the documentary's release, and now what a bipartisan congressional committee announced plans for public hearings on historical and contemporary misuse of classification to conceal potentially illegal operations. The Department of Defense issued a terse statement acknowledging the discovery of Arctic Cargo 66 while reserving comment on specific historical operations pending review. Perhaps most meaningful was the response from the families of the other crew members, many of whom reached out to Elliott directly. Catherine Harris, now 83, sent a handwritten letter that captured the bittersweet nature of finally knowing the truth. For 50 years, I've lived with the official story that Tom died because of a storm he should have avoided. I've carried that burden, wondering if he made a mistake, if he wasn't careful enough, if somehow I could have said something that morning that might have made him more cautious. Now I know he didn't fail. He was failed. There's grief in that truth, but also release. Tom didn't die from incompetence. He died from courage. From being someone who asked too many questions about things powerful men wanted to keep hidden. On October 30th, a memorial service was held in Anchorage for the crew of Arctic Cargo 66. For the first time, their deaths were publicly acknowledged not as victims of weather or mechanical failure, but as casualties of governmental overreach and institutional secrecy. The 5 names, Captain James Moore, co-pilot Robert Jenkins, navigator Thomas Harris, loadmaster Michael Chen, and flight engineer William Dane, were read aloud, each followed by the ringing of a bell. Among the attendees was Eric Halden, the former air traffic controller who had preserved the unaltered recording for half a century. At 79, he stood with the assistance of a cane, tearfully embracing family members of the men whose voices he'd been the last civilian to hear. I kept their real voices safe, he told reporters afterward. For 50 years I couldn't save them, but I could make sure the truth about how they died wasn't lost forever. Sometimes bearing witness is the only form of justice we can offer. Dr. Lena Carver's research team received formal recognition from the American Association for the Advancement of Science for their role in the discovery. In her acceptance speech, Carver noted the poignant intersection of climate science and historical justice. The same environmental crisis that threatens our future also revealed a buried injustice from our past. There's a lesson in that convergence. The truth may be buried for decades, but eventually, change brings it to the surface. In science, as in history, what matters isn't just what we discover, but what we do with that knowledge once it emerges from the ice. As winter approached, military recovery specialists completed the delicate process of extracting the remains of Arctic Cargo 66 and its crew from the Juneau ice field. The experimental device, still classified despite the revelations, was removed separately under high security. The bodies, remarkably preserved after 50 years in ice, were finally returned to their families for proper burial. William Dane was laid to rest in his hometown of Portland, Oregon, with full military honors. Honors that had been denied 50 years earlier, when his death was classified as an operational accident rather than a service-related fatality. Elliott placed his father's recovered logbook in the casket before it was closed, returning to him the record of courage that had finally brought truth to light. The words carved into William Dane's headstone echoed the message he had left on the aircraft bulkhead, transformed from warning to testimony. The truth cannot remain frozen forever. In the months following the documentary's release, the revelations about Arctic Cargo 66 triggered a cascade of related disclosures. The congressional hearings expanded beyond the specific incident to examine broader patterns of classification abuse across multiple agencies and eras. Retired military personnel, protected by new whistleblower immunity provisions, came forward with accounts of similar incidents: experimental weapons tested without adequate safety protocols, transport crews used as unwitting test subjects, accidents classified to avoid liability or public relations damage. What had seemed like an isolated historical tragedy increasingly appeared to be part of a systemic pattern spanning decades. Most significantly, documents began to emerge confirming General Westmore's claims about Project Heimdall. Internal memos detailed plans for deploying localized electromagnetic disruption systems in urban centers as crowd control assets, modern descendants of the technology that had doomed Arctic Cargo 66 50 years earlier. On January 17, 2026, the Secretary of Defense announced the termination of Project Heimdall, citing re-evaluation of ethical and constitutional considerations in domestic security applications. 3 senior program officials were placed on administrative leave pending investigation into potential violations of oversight regulations. For Elliot Dane, the vindication was meaningful but incomplete. During a television interview marking the 3-month anniversary of his documentary's release, he reflected on the mixed nature of the victory. The project that killed my father has been shut down in its current form. The truth about what happened to those 5 men is finally on record, but the system that made those decisions, that valued secrecy over safety, institutional protection over human lives, that system is still largely intact. He paused before continuing. What we've really exposed isn't just what happened in 1975. It's how easily it could happen again under different names, different justifications, but the same fundamental disregard for democratic oversight and basic human dignity. The Arctic Cargo 66 case began to appear in ethics curricula at military academies and law schools as a case study in the dangers of unchecked classification authority. Congressman Marcus Reynolds, whose father had served with Captain Moore in earlier assignments, introduced legislation dubbed the Sunshine and Classification Act, requiring automatic congressional notification of any program involving testing of potentially dangerous technologies on unwitting service personnel. Perhaps the most profound impact came in the form of dozens of other families who began their own quests for truth about military loved ones lost in classified operations. The Arctic Cargo 66 revelations created both legal precedent and public support for challenging long-standing official narratives about accidents, training mishaps, and mysterious disappearances spanning the Cold War era. Historian Dr. Rebecca Chen, specializing in government secrecy, observed that the case represented a crucial inflection point in the relationship between citizens and institutional authority. What the Arctic Cargo 66 discovery demonstrated wasn't just that this particular incident was misrepresented. It showed that the entire classification system has evolved from its intended purpose of protecting legitimate national security interests into a mechanism for avoiding accountability. When agencies can bury their mistakes and misconduct under layers of secrecy for 50 years, they're not just hiding information, they're eroding the foundation of democratic governance itself. For Dr. Lena Carver, the experience transformed her approach to scientific research. Her team began developing protocols for handling potentially sensitive historical discoveries, creating secure documentation methods that would preserve evidence even if governmental authorities attempted to restrict access. Science serves truth, not institutional convenience, she noted in a keynote address at the American Glaciological Society's annual conference. When our research reveals uncomfortable historical facts, our obligation is to the evidence, not to whoever might be embarrassed by it. As winter turned to spring, the wreckage of Arctic Cargo 66 was fully retrieved from the glacier. The aircraft, remarkably preserved after 50 years in ice, was carefully transported to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center, for restoration and eventual display. The exhibit, titled Silenced in the Sky, the Arctic Cargo 66 Story, would become one of the museum's most visited installations, a physical reminder of the human cost of unchecked secrecy. The message William Dane had scratched into the bulkhead, "Don't trust the cargo," was preserved. Exactly as found, becoming an iconic image reproduced in textbooks, news articles, and academic papers. What had begun as one dying man's desperate warning had transformed into a cultural touchstone, a reminder of the courage required to speak truth even when no one might hear it for decades. In that way, William Dane's final act achieved something rare in the face of institutional power. It ensured that the truth, though buried in ice for 50 years, would eventually find its voice. On March 11, 2026, exactly 51 years after the disappearance of Arctic Cargo 66, a closed hearing was held before a special Senate subcommittee on historical intelligence operations. Unlike the public hearings that had generated headlines and political posturing, this session focused on a single question: who gave the order to sacrifice the aircraft and its crew? Through meticulous document recovery and testimony from aging former officials, investigators had traced the decision chain to a man named Richard Colburn, who in 1975 had served as Deputy Director of Defense Research and Engineering. Colburn, now 94 and in failing health, was brought to the hearing in a wheelchair, accompanied by medical personnel and attorneys. His testimony, later partially declassified, was both chilling and revelatory. "Yes, I gave the order to activate the device's self-destruct sequence," Colburn acknowledged, his voice weak but his memory apparently intact. The prototype was showing signs of cascading failure. If it had continued to build power for another 20 minutes, it could have generated an electromagnetic pulse capable of disabling communications across half of Alaska, potentially including early warning systems monitoring Soviet activity. When Senator Elizabeth Harman pressed him on whether the crew had been informed of the decision or given any chance to attempt emergency landing procedures, Colburn's response was coldly pragmatic. There was a 70% probability that any attempt to land would result in catastrophic device failure during descent. The risk to potential population centers was deemed unacceptable. The crew's survival was a secondary consideration to preventing wider strategic vulnerability. "Did you inform their families of the actual circumstances?" the senator continued. "That would have compromised the entire program," Colburn replied. "The official determination of weather-related loss was deemed the appropriate classification." "Appropriate for whom, Mr. Colburn?" Senator Harman asked. "For the families who spent 5 decades believing their loved ones died due to poor judgment rather than deliberate sacrifice? For a public denied the right to know their government was testing domestic control technologies over American soil?" Colburn's response crystallized the institutional mindset that had enabled the tragedy. "Senator, in matters of national security, the truth is a luxury we cannot always afford." Though the statute of limitations prevented criminal charges for the decisions made in 1975, the hearing accomplished something perhaps more significant. It created an official, irrefutable record of institutional culpability. The deaths of the Arctic Cargo 66 crew were formally reclassified as service members killed in the line of duty through deliberate governmental action. This reclassification triggered automatic provisions for additional survivor benefits and formal governmental acknowledgement of wrongdoing. A rare institutional admission that echoed far beyond the specific case. It established precedent for similar reviews of other classified incidents where service members had died under suspicious circumstances. For the families, the reckoning brought complex emotions. Robert Jenkins's son Michael, now 56, expressed the ambivalence many felt. "Does it help to know my father was murdered rather than killed in an accident? In some ways, it's harder. But there's also a kind of peace in finally having the truth acknowledged. Dad didn't make a mistake. He wasn't careless. He was betrayed by the same system he'd sworn to serve. That matters, not just for his memory, but for everyone still serving today who deserves better protection than he received. The reckoning extended beyond governmental admissions. Media investigations revealed that 3 major defense contractors had been involved in Project Goliath's development, including one that currently held billions in Pentagon contracts. Shareholder activism drove one company to establish an ethics review board with specific authority over projects with domestic surveillance or control applications. Universities that had provided research support for the original technology faced their own reckonings, with faculty senates adopting enhanced ethical guidelines for classified research partnerships. The ripple effects touched institutions across the military-industrial academic complex, forcing reevaluation of practices long shielded from public scrutiny. For Elliot Dane, the Senate hearing represented both closure and continuation. In a reflective blog post following the testimony, he wrote, "Today I watched a 94-year-old man acknowledge that he gave the order that killed my father. There was no dramatic confrontation, no cinematic moment of justice. Just a frail human being explaining a cold calculation made half a century ago that treated 5 lives as acceptable collateral damage. I wanted to hate him. Part of me still does. But what struck me most wasn't Colburn himself. It was how the system enabled and protected his decision for 50 years. He didn't act alone. Dozens of people knew the truth and chose silence. Hundreds more maintained the classification that buried that silence. Thousands enforced the bureaucratic barriers that kept families from asking too many questions. My father's story isn't just about one bad decision or one flawed program. It's about how institutions convince good people to participate in terrible things by fragmenting responsibility until no one feels accountable for the final outcome. The glacier gave back my father's remains and his final message, but it's up to us to ensure the system that killed him doesn't simply evolve and rename itself again. That work isn't finished. It's barely begun. As spring arrived in Alaska, the Juneau ice field continued its inexorable retreat, revealing new secrets from the Earth's frozen archive. The team that had discovered Arctic Cargo 66 returned to their scientific mission, monitoring the accelerating impact of climate change on the region's glacial systems. But something had fundamentally changed in how they viewed their work. As Dr. Carver noted in her field journal, "We came to study how ice preserves the past. We discovered that sometimes what it preserves isn't just scientific data, but human truth. Evidence of choices and consequences that someone hoped would remain buried forever. The ice doesn't judge, it simply holds what falls within it, waiting for the inevitable moment when changing conditions bring it back to light. In that way, perhaps glaciers are the Earth's most honest historians, patient, impartial, and ultimately revealing." The truth of Arctic Cargo 66 had finally emerged from decades of frozen silence. But for those touched by its story, the question remained, how many other truths still waited beneath the ice? And who would have the courage to face them when they finally surfaced? 1 year after the discovery of Arctic Cargo 66, a permanent memorial was unveiled at the entrance to the Smithsonian's Aviation Exhibition. 5 steel pillars, each bearing the name and likeness of a crew member, stood in a semicircle around a central element. A replica of the aircraft's bulkhead bearing William Dane's blood-scratched warning. Visitors approached the memorial with hushed reverence, many leaving small tokens. Military challenge coins, flight wings, handwritten notes. At its base, what had begun as a half-century-old mystery had transformed into a cultural touchstone, a physical reminder of both institutional betrayal and the enduring power of truth to eventually emerge. The memorial's dedication plaque, co-authored by family members and historians, read simply, "To the crew of Arctic Cargo 66, silenced on March 11, 1975. Their final flight ended in ice, but their truth could not remain frozen. May we honor their sacrifice by protecting those who serve from the dangers of unchecked secrecy. Beyond physical monuments, the legacy of Arctic Cargo 66 manifested in concrete institutional changes. The Classification Review Act of 2026, passed with rare bipartisan support, established new limits on how long information could remain classified for reasons other than direct national security. It created an independent review board with authority to examine and potentially overturn classification decisions that appeared primarily motivated by avoiding embarrassment or liability. Military service protocols were updated to require explicit, informed consent before personnel could be exposed to experimental technologies or participate in classified testing programs. The Dane Provision, named for flight engineer William Dane, Septixean Simi Bain, specifically prohibited disciplinary action against service members who documented safety concerns about classified operations through appropriate channels. For the scientific community, the discovery sparked renewed interest in the potential of glacial archaeology, the study of what retreating ice sheets might reveal about both natural and human history. Research teams across Alaska, Greenland, and Antarctica began systematic surveys of areas where decades of secret military operations might have left traces now emerging from melting ice. Dr. Lena Carver established the Emerging Truth Initiative, a multidisciplinary project combining glaciology, forensic science, and historical research to identify and properly document potential sites of historical significance before climate change rendered them unrecoverable. Her work became a model for how scientific discovery and historical justice could advance together. "We're in a race against time," she explained during a TED Talk that garnered millions of views. "As our planet warms, ice that has preserved human activities for decades or even centuries is disappearing at an unprecedented rate. With it goes evidence, not just of ancient civilizations, but of recent history that powerful institutions hoped would never come to light." For Elliot Dane, the anniversary marked a transition. Having completed the mission to uncover what happened to his father, he turned his documentary skills toward similar cases: missing aircraft, disappeared expeditions, lost military units whose official explanations had never satisfied the families left behind. His production company, Frozen Truth Media, Sesters and Span Frollen, specialized in cold cases where institutional secrecy appeared to have obscured historical accountability. Each investigation built upon the methodologies developed during the Arctic Cargo 66 project, combining declassified documents, whistleblower testimony, advanced forensic techniques, and the power of public attention to pressure reluctant authorities. On the anniversary of his father's memorial service, Elliot visited Arlington National Cemetery, where a cenotaph now honored the crew alongside those who had fallen in more conventional service. As he placed a small model of a C-119 flying boxcar at the base of the stone, an elderly man approached, leaning heavily on a cane. "Mr. Dane?" the man asked hesitantly. "I'm not sure if you remember me. Eric Halden. I was the air traffic controller," Elliot finished, standing to shake his hand. "Of course I remember you. Your recording helped break the whole case open." Halden nodded, his eyes moving to the cenotaph. "I've been thinking a lot about your father lately. About all of them, really. For 50 years, I carried the weight of wondering if I could have done something differently that day. If I'd asked more questions when they took the tapes, or reported the discrepancies I noticed in the flight path, maybe they'd still be alive." "You did what you could," Elliot assured him. "You preserved the truth when everyone else was burying it. Without your recording, we might never have known what really happened." "That's kind of you to say," Halden replied. "But here's what keeps me awake at night, even now. How many other tapes were erased that no one saved? How many other crews disappeared whose stories we'll never know? Arctic Cargo 66 was found by accident because a glacier melted. What about all the secrets buried where nature won't help us? Elliot had no easy answer. The question cut to the heart of what his work had revealed. Not just about one incident, but about the vast architecture of secrecy that enabled it and countless others like it. As they stood in silence before the memorial, a school group approached, their teacher explaining the significance of the Arctic Cargo 66 case in the history of governmental accountability. Elliot overheard a teenage girl ask, "But how do we know it won't just happen again with a different project name?" The teacher's response was thoughtful. "We don't know for certain, but because of what was discovered here, we're asking questions we didn't know to ask before. Sometimes that's how progress works. Not by solving every problem at once, but by learning which questions need asking." That evening, Elliot sat at his desk reviewing footage for his next documentary, this one examining the disappearance of a research vessel in the Bering Sea in 1983 under similarly suspicious circumstances. On his wall hung a framed photograph of his father, standing proudly beside Arctic Cargo 66 before its final flight, alongside the last page from the recovered logbook. The final words William Dane had written, "Tell my son the truth," had become more than a father's dying wish. They had become a mission that extended beyond one family's tragedy to confront a system built on the premise that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. As Elliot reviewed classified weather reports that contradicted the official explanation for the vessel's loss, he reflected on what the Arctic Cargo 66 case had ultimately revealed. Truth, like the ice that had preserved his father's final message, might appear solid and unchanging on the surface. But beneath that appearance, currents of time and circumstance were always moving, always changing, always bringing what was hidden eventually back into the light. The real legacy of Arctic Cargo 66 wasn't just in memorials or legislation or even institutional reform. It was in the reminder that no secret stays buried forever, that given enough time, enough persistence, enough courage from those willing to ask uncomfortable questions, even the most carefully concealed truths will find their way to the surface. In the quiet of his office, surrounded by evidence of yet another mystery waiting to be solved, Elliot whispered a response to his father's final written words. "I found the truth, Dad, and I'm making sure it was heard." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall over Washington, D.C., each flake containing within it the promise that spring would eventually come again, melting what was frozen, revealing what was hidden, continuing the eternal cycle of burial and discovery that marks both natural history and human truth. The ice had spoken, and the world had finally listened.